presentation. It's some of you, if you came to the one in Bangalore, it's broadly the same kind of format. And then I was going to talk a little bit about some retailing questions, and then I was going to talk a little bit about some methodological issues which I think are really important. But because I suspect we're going to talk a little bit more about retailing topics later on when you guys come to the table, I'm going to skip a little bit over those and maybe save them for the discussion because we can't all talk about everything. And I think that when we talk about bridging research perspectives, a lot of times, we're talking about this, and VK talked a little bit about this yesterday, this bridging of rigor and relevance, and I find the whole idea that there's a dichotomy between those two things kind of funny, because I kind of wonder if I could ever go into a company and say, well, I have this very relevant answer to your problem, but I didn't do the research very well, it's not very rigorous, so you guys can still pay me, right? So there is no relevance without rigor, and there's a couple of little problems with how things are being done in a lot of research, particularly in the strategic fields, because I'm a sales management guy, really, coming from a kind of social psychology theoretical background, and what I'm really interested in is also methodology. And unfortunately my book is not available on the same stand, even though they published it. They should have joined the docs there, so you can't purchase it, but you could purchase it. And some of those things are a little bit, so I'm going to skip over these, a little bit relevant to what I'm talking about today that I wrote about a number of years ago, and I've kind of followed on. One of the things I'm going to talk a little bit, very briefly about to set the scene is the role of data. And this is something that I did my PhD, I finished it in 2003. And when I started my PhD, the biggest, most clever, advanced method to use when you were a strategy type person, I did my PhD in sales management, so I was kind of strategic, was structural equation modeling. It was the big thing. You could publish you could write a structural equation modeling article, you would definitely get it published in the Journal of Marketing. Now, with a survey, 200 salespeople or whatever, you get it published in the JM. Now, of course, as soon as I finished, that was already on the downswing. The cross-sectional data problems, stuff like that. And over the last 10 years, this need for better data has really started to heavily filter into the strategic marketing areas. Now, in consumer research, there has always been a real drive towards more experimental designs. And then there's also been what you could call the quantitative marketing framework, what I tend to call the econometric type framework, where we're using a lot of objective data. Now, in the strategic marketing area, that was very much unheard of until the last few years. Now, we have a problem if we're kind of based on a single-shot cross-sectional survey. It's just not going to get published for very good reasons. Of course, that's unfortunately led to a situation where people think survey research by itself is just the wrong thing to do, which is also not true. It's kind of like you don't want to go too far the other way. Survey research is the only way to get some sorts of data. The problem is relying on that as the sole research design for any study. Okay? Classic, strategic, retailing, sales management type researchers relied on a single shot cross-sectional study. Yeah? Now what we need is, we need to augment that a lot more with multiple sources of data, particularly for dependent variables. You need to be collecting independent and dependent variables from multiple sources of data. Yeah? Secondary performance data, for example, is great, and something that has been the model from consumer research for a long time, multiple studies. So we have maybe a large study which looks at an overall research topic, and then a set of smaller, maybe field experiments, which test certain parts of that model. So we're addressing internal and external validity problems. Now, strategic retailing type research hasn't done that traditionally until recently. And I think that is something that we really need to change our mindset in. And it's a big challenge though, because you know, what's the problem with business-to-business type research is that where does the data come from? We can't go and stand in a mall and ask consumers, or you know, we can't ask students either. You know, these are things that we have to address, and unfortunately it makes our job a lot harder. In fact, I published a paper. It's kind of a funny story. I published a paper in Journal of Marketing Theory and Practice a few years ago about multi-level models. And it was a real struggle to get this paper through the review process. It's actually a pretty decent paper, but the problem was we got a reviewer who said, I don't want to see this paper published because our job is hard enough already. You know? And then we had a great editor, Greg Marshall, who piloted that paper through and said this is kind of a dumb review. But you know, I kind of had sympathy for the guy, or girl, obviously, because you know it is tough to collect business-to-business data. You know, it's easier to collect consumer-level data in a general sense. Sorry, please don't destroy me for saying that. That's what us in the business-to-business field like to think. I'm sure you'll tell me it's different. Oh, okay. Don't tell me it's not working. Okay. Yeah, I've addressed this a little bit. Getting that kind of data is very difficult, okay? And there's no easy way of doing it. But one mindset change which I've kind of come to grips with a lot through my work with people from the more US background, because I come from a British education system, you know, PhD supervised in Britain, and our tradition was to get multi-company cross-sectional samples. Now, when I started working with people like Mike Hagan in Houston, it was very much about getting single company samples. Okay, that has issues of you know, whether this is applicable outside different companies, company level effects. But what it does allow you to do is raise the quality of data by partnering with a firm. Yeah. Now, in order to get multi-source data or say experimental data from multiple firms, that's just not possible. You can't go to 100 firms and say, give me access to your one single salesperson's performance records. You might get one firm saying, yeah, that's great, and then so you've got one data point. Now, if you partner up with that firm that's keen on working with you, you can get access to the whole sales force. Now, that is why people who are working in research centers like VK and Peter Verhoef, where the entire ethos of what they're doing is about partnering with firms, are a lot more successful at getting that kind of data than people who are coming from that multiple company cross-sectional background. And I think that's a big mindset change within the business-to-business. And retailing is also important here. So that's what I think we need to think about. We need much more multi-method work. So, you know, we have a survey because some things are amenable to surveys. We have an experiment, and then maybe we have a time series model, for example, and we're testing multiple different aspects of the same problem. This is a big shift in mindset amongst sort of more strategic type research. And I think we need to start thinking about designing research programs, not just single study approaches. I think that's a big, helpful change. Now, what I'm really interested in, and anyone who, well, probably for the one person who follows my work knows what I'm interested in, is measurement, okay? Measurement, I think, and so I'm drilling down into what I think are the important research methods issues, and I think measurement is the fundamental issue that we have to get right. If we don't know what we're measuring, then our models don't make any sense. Now, in some fields, things are a little easier. In economics, in some ways, if we want talking about concrete, observable type things, then we don't have so many big measurement issues. But when we're talking about more abstract things, then because coming from a sort of more psychological context, these are the things I'm interested in. Things like motivation, satisfactions, attitude, blah, 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 blah. We have big measurement problems. And some of the problems are because we don't really understand the critical measurement models, okay? And I'm going to give you a couple of little examples. Again, anyone who's aware of my work knows that I'm really critical of the formative model, which is really where some of the things I'm going to talk about have come from. And also this idea of multiple dimensions. This is to me a huge problem. And I'm going to give you some examples. I'm going to try to make you I'm going to try to force you to think the way that I think about these things and see if you agree with me. Because I think these are endemic issues in marketing research. Not just retailing, not just business to business, but in marketing in general. So let's have a little think. The first thing I think we get wrong a lot is conceptual definitions, right? A lot of times we don't know what we're trying to measure, right? And in fact, we're not measuring anything because we create these constructs which aren't real. They're impossible to be real. I'm going to give you some examples in a minute. It's what you would call inappropriate reification. Trying to pretend things are real when they're not, okay? Let me give you an example of something that is definitely real. Temperature, okay? That's real, right? Let me give you an example of something that might be real, but we're not sure. Emotion, okay? Emotion. Let me give you an example, it's going to be controversial here. Let me give you an example of something that's definitely not real. Service quality, right? I'm going to explain why in a minute. That doesn't mean service quality research is rubbish at all, which means it's not quite doing what a lot of people think it's doing. Okay, so we have to understand, this is my fundamental thing, the difference between measurement and testing. I'm going to briefly run you through a couple of conceptual experiments in your mind, just to get you thinking what I think, hopefully, okay? The first thing I want you to think about is when you think about your doctorate, you're thinking about, you've got a central construct probably that you're interested in studying. Is that thing real? I'm really pleased with this term I came up with. Does it have a convincing existence proposition? Can it exist without you being there to create it? Okay? Temperature did not need some physicist to come along and define what it was. He or she just put a name to it and gave us some measuring scales for it. It's a physical quality of the world. It's there, right? Okay? A lot of times when you really think about it, go through the literature, it's unconvincing that those things that we're talking about are real. Quality is not real, okay? Performance. Now, I'm deliberately not defining these things, okay? You'll get that. Performance is not real. Socioeconomic status is not real. Brand equity, in my humble opinion, the way it is defined is not real. These are things that are defined by researchers and created. That doesn't mean they're useless. It just means they're not independent of what's called their measurement. Let me explain to you. I've got two examples. This is the first example. And this is why I kind of thought about brand equity, because this is what's called shopping mall equity, right? I hope none of these people are in the room right now. This has happened to me before. And I want you to ignore those things. I want you to think about this thing called mall image, okay? Let us trace the causality through this diagram, very briefly. Mall image apparently, okay, this is apparently a multi-dimensional model of mall image, right? Okay, ignore those other things. Mall image is causing convenience, is causing environment, whatever that is, it's causing the quality of the product, and it's causing the quality of the surface at the mall. You don't need to be a rocket scientist to know what's wrong here. What could mall image be that causes those things? Because that's, I mean, even though you might say it's a measurement model, the rules of causality have to apply here. That's how measurement works. So, what's the first problem here? Can anyone point that out to me? Yeah, if you want to be simple about it, you could say these arrows are in the wrong direction, right? Okay? What would you say? Ha ha! Thank you for that. I would say the other answer to the question is that we could define that as perceived. Mall image is a perception in general of the mall. I think this mall is nice. I think this mall is good. Blah blah blah. And these could be perceived. It could I thought about this last night, so I'm glad you pointed it out. You could say, if I think the mall in general is nice, so it has a positive image, it could cause me to perceive those things, yeah, as the mall might be more convenient, the mall might have a nicer environment. That's possible, and again, but we are now measuring different things.
What is quality? How to quantify the quality? How to define the quality of the service?
Say quality for the next slide. Okay, that's a great point, but I'm going to save it. You've got a great point, but first of all, we have to define what that is, and we haven't measured it now. Okay? All of a sudden, we're saying that this thing affects my perceptions of these things, but I haven't measured it now. So I should have another measure of the more general, more image.
Or you can manipulate it.
You could, yeah. That's from the experimental standpoint, that's a great point as well. But the fact is, we haven't defined these things properly, certainly. I could say those were perceptions which were caused by a general perception of the mall. But it's probably more helpful to a business owner to think about these things as actual features of the mall that would cause an overall positive perception. So well, I totally get that you could argue that, and if we wanted to do a study of that, yeah, we could do that. But I would think, you know, in terms of, if you talk about what BK was saying about what's useful to journal and marketing readers, the owner of the mall would probably want to look about the characteristics that they could manipulate that would cause the image to change, maybe.
But why wouldn't they manipulate the image of the mall?
How do they manipulate it?
By the brand equity of the mall, you know? So this is a cool mall, and then you're a cool mall, and then you perceive the quality of the mall.
Yeah, but why would I want to know that? Well, wouldn't I rather as a manager, wouldn't I rather as a manager know the concrete things I could change about my mall? Like change how convenient it is to park at the mall, which would then cause people to have a better image? Yeah, it could go either way, but the fact of the matter is,
what you're saying is that there are things that the market will show us. Right? He says, I got these 5 levers to work with.
yeah.
Right? That is what, in my opinion, is what I can show us. Everything else is a result from
But
that.
you can control the advertising, the image, you know, this is like
You
what
could.
all the rich people do.
Exactly.
And the fact that I have to walk 3 blocks, that's convenient, because it could have been 20 blocks.
Exactly. But I guess we're kind of slightly drifting away. But I told your point is completely correct, but we haven't defined our constructs properly at a minimum. Say again?
5 minutes.
Perfect. We haven't defined our constructs correctly. So we're arguing about, is it perception of mall image? Is it perception of convenience? Or is it convenience? Those things are different. 2 different constructs. Perception of convenience, actual convenience. That's a great point. Thank you. Now, so someone talked about quality, and Mike, I was kind of hoping to lead into this slide from your question, but we got into another thing. You could flip the arrows around, and here is a great example of a model that's done that. Website quality, you see this all the time. This is a formative model. These things together create, ignore the numbers, please ignore the numbers, create website quality. My next question is, what is website quality? Apart from those 4 things in this model, is it anything else? Well, okay, the answer is no. Quality is just what you just defined what quality was, right? You're not measuring quality anymore, you're testing it. In the same way that you might, did anyone take the GMAT before they did their, they got into the university? Yeah, okay, it's the same thing as the GMAT, right? So think about this, website quality as your GMAT score, right? Now, imagine I was to tell you that I'm weighting question 10 on the GMAT 80%, and I'm weighting question 10 on the GMAT for you at 2%. It's unfair, right? You can't compare. Yet we see hundreds of papers running this model which let the data decide the weightings of the individual items. Okay? Now, as soon as I start talking to you about testing, you realize how unfair that is. Because I can't arbitrarily decide which one of these is important for quality. I decided that because I defined what quality was. This is not a real thing. It's just a researcher-defined composite. Okay? I define quality as being these things for whatever reason. Now, this is, you know, the roots of the problems with this formative model, but it runs deeper than that. It's not a measure. It's a researcher-defined thing. Think about all of the other constructs in the literature which are broadly similar. Researchers define things that don't exist by themselves. Quality here did not exist before the researcher decided. It was this, 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 and this. Make sense? These are the two critical issues with measurement I think we have to face, and they all come down to construct definition. Now, I'm just about finished. The prior models are problematic as measurement models. If we are not representing what's going on in the real world accurately, our structural theories are not being tested accurately. Okay? And this is not something that is restricted to one particular research field. I think it's exemplified across various different fields. And I think, yeah, I'm not going to run through that because I've just talked about it. And I've just used these examples. And my critical thing that I want people to take away is that testing something is not necessarily measuring something. For a measurement to be made, there has to be a real thing in existence. Or you have to at least be able to define logically that there might be a real thing independent of those measurements. Yeah, like temperature, right? Temperature doesn't change if you measure it using the Celsius scale versus Fahrenheit scale. Make sense? Or even if you stick your finger and say, oh, hot versus cold, right? Website quality changes dependent on how the researcher defines what it is. So it's not a measuring problem, it's a testing problem. Different things. Test development focuses on content, yeah, which often means it has to be broad. Measure development focuses on this vague idea of construct validity. Often means it should be narrow. We get those things confused, we end up with bad measures. Okay? Now, again, we don't have time to go into these issues. But this is kind of what we end up with. And if you haven't read this article by Feynman, Cargo Cult Science, okay, you should go and read it. One of my favorite little pieces of research, well, it's not really research, of sort of polemic about what's wrong with, well, in his mind, kind of social science, I guess. It's a bit depressing. Go and read it, but what we're missing in a lot of our work is significant, strong construct definitions, backed up by strong research designs and data collection, which would allow us to make stronger hypotheses. For example, in hard sciences like physics, they don't say, I think there's a positive relationship that I'm going to go look for. And it's funny that in the last session we mentioned the Large Hadron Collider, right? You know, remember that whole thing about, you know, we're going to find the Higgs boson. Do you know what the p-value that they used for whether it was a significant result was? Instead of it's 0.05, we're used to, right? It was something like 0.000000005. And for a specific value of the signal, not just positive or negative, right? Well, we don't do that yet. Well, you know, we have limits to what we can do, but we are not even approaching the limits of what we can do yet. We just have these vague positives and negatives at 5%. What we need to do is think, well, I think this value should be X value. When we, you know, that's a strong theory. Positive and negative is pseudo-strong. Okay, I'm going to finish there. I've rushed through it a little bit, but I don't want to dominate the whole thing, so that's where I'm going to finish. Thank you for the contributions that were brilliant. There we go. Thank you.